I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Brian Kinghorn, and I see Sandy is also included on the slide, so Sandy as well. And Dr. Kinghorn is an emeritus professor from the University of New England. He's an Australian, and you'll very much get that in just a moment when he speaks. He's but well known in our animal breeding community for a variety of things. One of the most notable is he's been over his career very directly engaged in production problems and brings a very high technical skill set to those problems and drives a set of tools, most recently MateCell, but there's a whole other set of software accumulation over time that's been a great contribution to our animal breeding community. So as a scientist in that space, just express our thanks to you for your continued work over time, make those tools available. They've been very, very useful to us. Most recently, he's continued to evolve and develop a product, a software package called MateCell, and he's going to describe that for us tonight. But MateCell's actually been, I'm sure you'll give us the history, around for quite a while, and continues to evolve in the genomic space in particular, but a very useful platform. And Dr. Kinghorn, thanks for making the long trip, and we look forward to your comments. Thank you. Thanks, Paul.
Well, thank you, Bob, and the organizing committee. It's a great honor and a great opportunity as well to come to BIF and speak to you about this material. Sandy and I have enjoyed a good 3 days here in Calgary, and we're looking forward to going to the Stampede on Friday. And I've been to Calgary myself once before, and that was in 1986. And I came on a bus trip. And it's just possible other people in the room here, maybe one or two of you, I think one, were on that bus trip as well. Anyone come on a bus trip to Calgary in 1986? You can put your hand up. That was a wonderful bus trip. It was organized and beautifully hosted by Gordon and Myra Dickerson. And we were starting off after the Lincoln, Nebraska World Congress meeting. We had to get a couple of weeks later to the Kansas State Animal Science meeting. So we tripped around for a couple of weeks on the buses and came here. And Gordon is he was the ultimate gentleman, of course, and a very good educator. And I learned a lot about the North American beef industry in that trip. But that's nearly 40 years ago, and I've forgotten all that already. So that's why Sandy and I are going to be spending the rest of this month. We'll be over in the US, and hopefully we'll start to learn back again about these things. So, and I'd like to thank my co-author, Sandy. I've learned a great deal from him over the last years. And he's a software engineer, and I guess it's a two-way street from the learning. And so it's a sheer pleasure to work with him. So precision matching of objectives and technologies. We're moving a little bit away from the greenhouse gas sort of area, but I think I'll probably be able to bring that in a touch. So matching objectives and technologies. So you set your objective, and then you use technologies to get there. Well, it's not like that in practice. The technologies evolve, they change, there's a variety of technologies, and new and old technologies bring different opportunities. And those different opportunities mean that you can actually go in different directions. And the objectives that you set really depend on how far you can go in each direction. So it's difficult in a vacuum to work with breeding objectives. You've got to look at how you get there and match the two together. And you've got to do that with precision. So I'm picking up on the precision theme from the conference. You can't really have a hand-waving exercise and say, this is really where we want to go, and this is how we're going to get there, without having some level of precision in pulling it all together, because there are so many technical components involved, and also practical logistical factors and so forth. And as beef breeders, you've got to end up at the end with action decisions that you take, and they've got to be connected sensibly to both the objectives and the technologies you've got available. So where to go is all about objectives, and how to get there is all about the technologies, but the two dance a dance with each other. And I think you'll see what I mean when we go through the slide set here. So what I want to do first of all, well, there's another question which you hope you don't have to answer. If you end up in the wrong place, how do you get back? And you'll see a little bit about that in just the next couple of slides. So this is an old tool which we've used over many years for teaching students about selection index. And you'll see you've got a bunch of genetic parameters and economic weightings and so forth as starting points there. But I've just arbitrarily labeled these as two traits, trait 1 and trait 2. And the concept here is that you as a breeder are sitting bang in the middle of that graphic. That's where you are now. And the yellow ellipse tells you theoretically where pushing in all the different directions you could push for just those two traits, for simple illustration here, where you could go. So you could go anywhere on that yellow ellipse. And let's say for trait 1 and trait 2, you want to increase both of those. So you want to be in the top right-hand quadrant. Unfortunately, there's a negative correlation there. So you're moving a bit uphill, but there's a bonus to that, which I'll show in a moment. So selection index, well, that takes you where the place is most economically important to be. And for that, we need to put on some kind of description of what the economic values are. Most selection indices use linear economic values. Not all of them, but that's what you get there. So anywhere along a purple line is theoretically of equal economic value to end up at. The red line in the top right is the most economically favorable, but you can only be in marrying the yellow genetics with the purple economics. The selection index is designed to take you as far along as possible on that contour, on the economic contours. And that's why that red circle is, that's where you are. Now, if you change the technology, so we've talked a bit about objectives here and realizing them with a selection index. If you change the technology and you manage to use higher density genotyping and get more accurate EPDs for trait 2, or you change the correlations, then what can happen is that where you can go in terms of the yellow line, it changes because you've got technology to take you there. But the economics hasn't changed. In most cases, when people are calculating economic weightings, they don't include heritability and genetic correlations. They don't include concepts of how to get there. They just tell you the value of being there. And yet you can see that using the same index with that change in technology, the best place to be is actually in a different direction. Now, that different direction in that particular case takes us below the line as opposed to above the line for trait 2. And you might know as a breeder that it's going to be a bit more difficult to sell semen or whatever from that area, and you want to push it a bit further up. Or it may well be that we're talking about some greenhouse gas trait here, and that's trait 2. And falling below the line is politically, if nothing else, rather sensitive. If people find out that you've got a breeding program which has actually got negative trend for that trait, that might be a problem for you. But if you look along the purple line, I'll apologize to people on that side, but I think and I'll pick up one of these. So hopefully you can still hear me. So if you move along the purple line up here, you can see that you can move that red dot just with your eyes up over here, for example, and the compromise in reduction in the merit in the overall index is rather small. So there's no reason you can't do that. You just change where you go. The reason that you can do that is because you're dancing along a frontier. It's like a plateau here. And you've got great flexibility to actually change the direction of the breeding program with minimal compromise in the theoretical economic value. So you should take those opportunities, I would suggest. It's not the sort of thing that scientists have said, you stick to the index and you go for it. It's not really true. You do have some flexibility. If the favorable direction was going to be up here, I don't think this will actually, maybe it will. I'm sorry, I'll stick up with this one. If you're in the peaky end of this ellipse and you start to move in either direction, then you lose much more. So that's the bonus of going uphill against a correlation. You actually have flexibility. And we'll talk later about the potential for you to actually diversify your breeding program in 2 different directions. If that was the wrong thing to have done, because you're specializing, looking for selling bulls or specialized in those 2 different directions, then by crossing the resulting lines further down the track, you would end up in the middle here and not too far off where you would have been if you'd gone in that direction in the first place. So those are the sorts of things where some subjective decision-making comes in. Okay, so we've got the questions of where to go, and that's all about exploring different directions. we've talked a little bit about a couple of traits there, but you've got multiple traits, you've got genetic markers, we've got emphasis on diversity and inbreeding, which is probably not quite as important for individual breeders in beef and dairy, but more important at the breed society level, perhaps. Different patterns of mating constraints, the practical logistical constraints, movements of animals, even things like quarantine barriers and so forth, and also the availability of artificial insemination, IVF, sex semen, and so forth. And then there's the other question, how to get there, and that's where the preciseness comes in. You need to be able to use all the available information, which I list there, in order to make a prediction of the impact of what your set direction and actions are. And that's when you get these things to work with each other. Where to go, you can modify, because you realize that your prior ideas about where you would go are not the best, because when you are precise in working out what the outcomes are, you realize instead of going here, you could have gone slightly different direction, but reached over there. And that's a better place to be than back here. And you'll see what I mean when we start playing with this. Okay, so we're going to talk about technical requirements of a system to do this. And we've got a system to do this. And I've actually called it a technical requirement that the breeder should have ownership of the result, because that brings relevance. And a fancy computer tool is of little value if it's not relevant to the needs of the breeder. And you will see, I think, as we go through this, that the breeder who works with this does take ownership of the results, because there's a fair bit of decision-making in setting directions taking place. And it's in the context of your own animals and other candidates that are available to you, so you can see the actual nature of the outcome quite comprehensively. So you have the opportunity to have ownership of that outcome. So the breeder needs to have the power to target a wide range of possible outcomes. And we work across all the animal industries and in aquaculture and plants. So that means that we have to have a very wide range of possible technologies to satisfy all those different industries. And that wide range of technologies becomes available to all the other species. And sometimes you might find there are opportunities that have not been thought of before when you're using a system like this. So we always need to keep it as simple as possible. And I'll talk about some work that Sandy's leading in our company of two in order to help achieve that. But we also need it to be as complex as necessary. So it's a question of balance there in terms of presentation of this to the breeders. We'll talk about that later. So at this stage, we were going to do a live demonstration. That's a little bit challenging with multiple screens and distance and zooming and so forth. So you're going to have a flick book movie. So I've got another 20 slides or so, but they'll probably only take a few seconds each. So this is instead of doing a live demonstration. So what you see now is our standard